Hi guys, my name is Greis. I hope you're doing well and I welcome you to a new video. JetpackCompose comes with a variety of layouts. While the box, row and column layout are rather simple layouts, you can build more complex UIs with the so-called constraint layout. If you started building Android apps in the era of XML layouts, you might already be familiar with the constraint layout. In the view-based system, Android Studio delivered a great support for this layout because it had an integrated visual editor where you could move anchors from view to view and so automatically create the respective constraints inside the XML. However, of course, you could always manually edit these constraints and write them by yourself in the XML file. By defining all these constraints and aligning these views side by side, you had a great option for building responsive layouts. However, with JetpackCompose, there's also a constraint layout composable that we can use just like in the legacy way, but unfortunately the visual editor is no longer available for JetpackCompose. In this video I will give you a rudimentary overview how you can use the constraint layout just like you did it in the view system in JetpackCompose. Let's start by quickly jumping into Android Studio. And here you can see the old visual editor, and we start by creating a very simple layout in the view system. So let's create a very simple UI here, 2 buttons. The first button will be called button 1 and the second button that will be button 2. And now we need to create our constraints. So let's do it by saying here, this button should be constrained to the sides of the parent layout and also to the top and to the top of this button. The second button, however, should be constrained to the bottom of the parent layout and should be centered to this button here. And what we can do now is to select both of these buttons, and then we can say chains and create a vertical chain. And you can see that here a little chain got created. And now I also want these buttons to be side by side. So I once again right click, go to chains, and now you can see that I have some options here. Spread inside, and packed. We will take packed. And the buttons are aligned side by side, centered in this layout here. So let's try to recreate what we saw here. And the first step to use the constraint layout in your JetpackCompose app is to add the following dependency. Make sure to have the Android X constraint layout compose in your dependencies block. Now let's see how we can recreate this little example. I have a dummy button composable here that will imitate the buttons we just saw. And we have also a preview here, so we can preview our layout later. And the CL sample, the constraint layout sample, will be the layout or composable that will contain our layout. And as a first step, we create a constraint layout. If you have the dependency correctly added to your project, you also should see this composable here. And now I can say modifier, and say fill max size. We want to fill out the whole screen with this layout. And now the first thing you will always need to do when using the constraint layout is to define what references are in your respective layout. So in our case, we have 2 buttons. So we use the Kotlin's destructor, and it looks like this. We say here in parentheses button 1 and button 2. And as you can see here, we are in the constraint layout scope. So we have some additional functions here that we can use. So one of these is the create refs function, and this function creates constraint layout references. And because we're using the Kotlin destructor, we can use this syntax here, and we can also say specify type explicitly, and you see the button 1 and also the button 2 is of the type constraint layout reference. And what we can do with these references, I will show you in a second. But the first thing we want to do is to recreate the chain we just saw. If we quickly go into the XML we created, and I go to the code view and take a look at the first button here. This should be the button 1, just to make it clear, button 2. We can see that we have at the first view the constraint vertical chain style packed. And this implies that these two buttons are in a chain. And if we want to recreate this, we can simply say create vertical chain. And now we only need to add the respective references to our composables later, which is button 1 and button 2. And we also want to add a chain style, which is the packed style. And as you can see, we could also add in bias here, just like you saw it in the XML. But the default is 0.5, therefore we don't need that for now. And now that we created the vertical chain, we should create the actual composables we want to show. So let's start by creating a new dummy button, and we say button 1 and also a second button, and we call it button 2. If I quickly run the preview here, we can see that both of the composables are in the top left corner. Why is that? I mean, we created the refs here, we created vertical chain because the composable still don't know which reference refers to which composable. So let's define that as the next part. We can do that by adding a modifier. And here we add the constraint as modifier, which comes from the constraint layout. And for the first one, we say this is button 1. And we can open a block here, and we can see that here we have the constraint scope. And with the constraint scope, we can set the constraints just like we saw it in the XML. Let's quickly open up side by side the XML. And let's see. Okay, we have here a bottom to top of button 2. So let's do that. We say bottom of our button 1 here, and then we can say link to button 2, and we also say top. Then we want to have the end of our view or the composable constraint to the parent, just like the start. And if you don't want to repeat ourselves, we can just say center horizontal to parent. And if we quickly go into this function, we can see that it also uses the link to and just says other, which is parent in our case, link to the start, and the end to the other end, and use a bias, which is once again the 0.5 per default. And now the last part, because we have the start, we have the end, and also the bottom, is the top, which we also link to the parent top. And yeah, that's it. The composables are per default set to wrap content. So if you want to use, for example, fill to constraints, you could also do that. For example, you say width and then dimension, and you already see the options here, wrap content, which is just like I just said, the default, filter constraints, match parent, and so on. In our case, we don't need that, and we can try out what we just built here. let's see. Quickly rebuild. And as you can see, the button 1 is correctly constrained. However, the bottom is not correctly constrained because the layout still doesn't know what the button 2 belongs to. So let's fix that. Create another modifier and say once again constraint as, and this time refer to the button 2. And we open once again the block here. Now let's take a look at the XML once again. And we see, okay, the bottom is constrained to the parent's bottom. So let's do that. Bottom, link to parent bottom. And then we want to link the start and the end once again to a single component, and we can once again use the set horizontal, this time to the button 1. And the top finally links to also the button 1, and there we use the bottom. So top links to button 1's bottom. So the top links to the button 1 bottom. And if we now once again take a look at the layout here and preview it, and we can see that the JetpackCompose layout looks just like the layout in the previous example from the XML. And as you can see, it's not that hard to build these layouts. It's always the same. You use these references, link them to specific composer builds, and have all the options you have also in the XML way or the editor and so on. But of course, the visual editor is missing. But with these handy helper functions, it's rather easy to create these layouts. To sum up, in this video we saw how we can use the visual editor to create an XML based constraint layout, and we also saw how we can create the same layout in JetpackCompose using the constraint layout JetpackCompose equivalent. And in my opinion, it's very handy to use, and almost all the functions you know from the visual editor are also available in JetpackCompose. Of course, you don't have the option for using the visual editors. You all need to do all by yourself. But if you need to migrate all layouts, it's also no hassle to go through this migration process and recreate these layouts in JetpackCompose. I hope you had some takeaways. Like the video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, activate the notification bell, and I hope to see you soon.